Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's session titled Take VDI to the Next Level, presented by Phil Alberta, the CIO at IPM. My name's Shannon Hazing, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I want to take just a moment or two to go through some housekeeping items and let you know how to participate in today's session. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode. Should you have a question during this session, just simply type it into the question pane and press send. At the end of the presentation, we'll do a Q&A and take as many questions as we have time for. We will make sure to get back to you on all of the questions if we're running up against time post-event. Now I'd like to hand it over to Phil Alberta to get the session started. Phil?
Thank you, Shannon. Welcome, everybody. I am very excited to be with you this afternoon. Looking forward to getting through this and helping you take VDI to the next level. A little background on me. I've been at IPM for 3 years, acting as a CIO. My role here is to make sure the best technology solutions meet your business needs. And prior to IPM, I was the VP of Business and Technology at Tiffany & Company. There I had global responsibility for the infrastructure, operations, risk management, and IT governance processes, and I was actually a customer of IPM. As far as this webinar goes, this is the first in a series of webinars we are looking forward to bringing you in the new year. This one in particular will touch on the key components of a great virtual desktop implementation. Future sessions will be deeper dives into some of the individual topics we highlight today, and I'm going to jump into it right away. Okay, so just a quick background on IPM. We are a New York-based consulting firm. We have long-standing relationships in a lot of industries in New York and dealt with some of the most prestigious firms in a lot of verticals, including legal and finance, but also retail, some government work, and hospitality as well. We really focus on strategy, architecture, and implementation services, so it's not just the design, but also building the house as well. We have deployed over 50,000 seats of virtual desktops and many, many more virtual applications. And this past year, we were selected by Goldman Sachs to be the only third-party presenter at their firm's Client Technology Conference. We also have great partnerships with many of the key vendors in this space. Since we only have about 30 minutes today, we're going to jump right into it. So, why are we here? Basically, everyone that's either tried VDI or is looking into VDI is going to fall into one of these 4 quadrants when they do their implementation. And there's always a focus on value, but also how well the environment works, because those are the 2 most important things that really measure the success of any VDI implementation. So if we start down the bottom left, the experiment, I call it, is when IT is taking a grassroots initiative, trying to do a POC, maybe tinkering with it with some remote users, maybe tinkering with it with some developers. Typically very small environment, not a lot of infrastructure behind it, not a lot of subject matter expertise behind it, and used mostly by IT. If we move over to our right, on the bottom is the tactical solution. This is this category I think most of the environments we see fall into. It's typically driven by some event. For example, Hurricane Sandy drove many clients or many folks into a new DR plan for their desktop or remote access. Sometimes it's application performance. A new application is important to the business, but it's not performing well because of either the resource it requires on a PC or the resources it requires on the back end. A company may be moving buildings and they want to move to something simpler and or reduce cost. So any of those type of things typically drive and actually fund VDI implementations. And it could be a virtual desktop like Zen Desktop, where it's a dedicated PC per user, or it could be a shared desktop like a Zen App Desktop, or a combination of the 2. I'm going to use those interchangeably today. If you have questions specifically about which is which or when to use which, we can dive into that separately, but just in general, a virtual desktop in this case could be either or. Additionally, on the tactical solution, there is usually a decent investment because there is a nice business reason behind it. You have a broader user base, and most of the time there is some general oversight and training that really goes behind it to make sure that it's functional and meets the requirements of the users. Still not the highest value. It's more to solve on either an operational need or something like that. If we go up to the upper left, this one we see occasionally, and this is what I call compartmentalized. There is a very specific business reason for using VDI, such as having offshore developers, for example, where the data needs to remain in the US to be secure. They have a pretty heavy desktop they need to use, a lot of tools that need to be installed, and that desktop can be replicated over and over and over again based on the number of developers. Typically, it is built kind of in a vacuum or in its own little bubble for a specific need. It's somewhat scalable, but a little bit difficult to scale. The people supporting it probably know more about it than anybody else, and it typically isn't managed or integrated into the whole IT operational processes. And the last quadrant on the upper right really, I think, is the goal that we strive for to really take the most advantage of VDI, is really creating a strategic platform where a VDI or virtual desktop is the equivalent of a desktop, right? So whatever you can do on your physical desktop, you can do on your virtual desktop. It can be used by all kinds of folks in the environment. It has somewhat firm-wide acceptance. The experience is pretty solid and resilient. And more importantly than all those things is it's actually embedded into how you do your day-to-day IT. Very critical, I think, in the acceptance of and the consistency of virtual desktops in the environment. What's interesting, though, is whenever we talk to anyone in any of the four quadrants, all users assume that everything runs like it's in the fourth quadrant. It's supposed to be rock solid, it's supposed to be fast, everybody's supposed to know how to use it, how it's going to work, and that typically is not the case. So what we call that, Shannon, if you could hit the button, is really your opportunity for greatness. And what we're saying there is if you can get to that place, you then have the opportunity to really gain wide adoption of the desktop. You have really a chance to generate some efficiencies in your effort and your investment and realize the potential from a mobile perspective and have that rock solid performance and stability so you can do other things. And what we're going to spend time on today is really talking about what we've seen as the keys to get there. Based on the time we have remaining, we'll touch on them at a high level, and as I mentioned earlier, we're going to have webinars on each one in the new year. We can also, of course, have some in-person conversations or conference calls about your specific scenarios. So the 5 guiding principles to getting to the next level are listed here on the page. These come from our experience both in the actual practical building and delivering of solutions and the lessons learned from there, as well as some of the years of experience we've had doing virtual applications and solving user problems after virtual desktops or virtualized applications have been implemented. Real quick, I'll run through these and then we'll dive into each one. So first and foremost, the user is king. User acceptance drives the success of VDI. They're 100% tied together and correlated, that if you don't have a happy user, you're not going anywhere with VDI. So very important. It is the highest priority on the list. I think most of us think of it that way. It's a matter of how do we deliver it that way and really meet their needs. Second, we want to architect with the user and IT in mind. And I think what we've seen a lot of the times is it's either one or the other or a little bit of both, but it's not really a comprehensive look at how do we do both the delivery of a great service and the management on an ongoing basis. So we'll talk about that. Third, education. Education is key in this case, and it's not training, it's really education, and we'll dive into some of the folks that need education and what kind of education they need, and also when it's appropriate or opportunistic to really leverage subject matter experts like my team that have done this again and again and again and have seen a lot of what you're doing before and can teach you the whys and the what fors and also what the impact of the decisions you make are. Fourth, making sure you really have end-to-end management around this thing. You are delivering a service, so it's very important that that service is rock solid and you do have disciplines around change and testing, etc., so that that experience is the same every day when the user accesses the system. And lastly, and I think the most overlooked in IT in general for all projects, is doing your own PR and making sure that you're touting the successes when they come in, you're selling the benefits of the solution so you get the goodwill from the management team and the users of the system. Jumping into the user experience. So the 4 or 5 key things. So number 1, making sure you define use cases with the business around actual work processes. What we mean there is a use case is not remote access. A use case is not disaster recovery. A use case is not BYOD, right? It's really what kind of work do they want to accomplish in those cases. So if it's a work from home or mobility solution, let's make it around what they're trying to accomplish when they work from home. Do they need the ability to edit documents? Do they need to be able to access some internal system that's critical to a deal they're working on or to a case they're working on? Those are the things you want to make sure we show them how to do well with the tools we're going to provide. Then we're marrying what they're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to accomplish, and we have a win-win. Second, make sure that experience is consistent across the board. The applications that they use in one environment, whether it's physical or virtual, should match up with the applications they use in another environment. Not to say they should use that full-blown version of Outlook on their iPad, but they should know it's there. They should know that the preferences are there, their signature is there, those kind of things, so that wherever they go, they know how to get on the system, they know what to expect, and they know that what they do in any of these places is going to be consistent and follow them around. Next, you really want to make that image as robust as possible. The more the user has to wait, the more frustration occurs. So getting rid of and stripping out of unnecessary services, updater processes, other applications that run in the background that aren't critical to that environment, that maybe you couldn't prevent in the physical, but you can prevent in the virtual, you want to make sure that happens. And then lastly, make the right investment in infrastructure. One of the things we've seen time over time is, as we showed those quadrants in the beginning, if you're in that experiment or you're in that compartmentalized quadrant, you really aren't going to be able to scale real well. And if you did a great job building the environment, people are going to want to use it. Then you're going to have to make sure the experience is there. And a lot of times, it's faster adoption than it is infrastructure put behind it. So you have to get that infrastructure in there, size it correctly up front. There are plenty of tools for that. There's also, if you have the opportunity to over-provision a little bit, you want to do that so that you can grow into it. That folds right into how we architect with the user and IT in mind. So we want to take a layered approach. What I mean by that, really, and I'm going to dive into that in its own slide in a second, but what I mean by that is really to make sure you can create these layers of abstraction between the infrastructure, the operating system, the user profile, the applications, and their data, so that you can create the best possible experience with some flexibility of management. That's probably one of the most important items on this list and worthy of its own slide, and we'll hit that in about 2 minutes. Next, we want to make sure you develop the solutions for both physical and virtual PCs. It's very often that the virtual environment is delivered one way and the physical delivered another, and with a little bit of overlap, whether it's System Center or something else as overlap, but in general you're managing 2 PCs. You want to do that as little as possible. You want to make sure that if you're going to deploy an application, that it can be deployed to a physical or a virtual PC, because then your application delivery process is standard and consistent, and you only have to learn one process, right? Next, you want to make sure when you're taking this undertaking on, even if you've done it already, you really rationalize the list of applications. Deploying every application that's on a PC is going to create frustration. It's going to lead you down the more persistent versus non-persistent path, which means more virtual environments to manage than less, which was kind of the reason you did this in the first place, and create more need for testing, more need for troubleshooting, et cetera, et cetera. Then you want to make sure, and this one I think is interesting because sometimes people don't realize they can do this, is you want to make sure you're dynamically directing users to the best environment possible. So if I'm in London and my data is in New Jersey, I may want to launch that application from New Jersey, even in a virtual desktop I received in London. so that I'm getting the best performance locally. And many times when we architect regionally, but don't think about the ability we have to extend the services from one region to another to provide the best experience possible. That could be actually a very, very huge selling point for that mobile user that maybe had been frustrated with VDI in the past, or is skeptical of using VDI, or doesn't like that they're off, when they're offline they don't have access. If the trade-off is great performance from that hotel in Singapore, that's a huge possible advantage. So think about that. And then lastly on this list, again, thinking about keeping IT in mind, is how are you going to support it? Putting a bunch of tools in, or scripts or processes that you're unfamiliar with, or that you don't have the resources to support it or run it, really is a recipe for disaster. So making sure that you're thinking about, how am I going to update this image in the future? It's very easy to do, and how can I make sure that when there is a problem, I can quickly solve it? We're going to take a quick poll before we jump into the layered approach. If you could just answer any, or just check any or all that apply real quick, and we'll see how everyone's delivering applications.
We'll keep the poll open for about 15 more seconds.
Okay. So it's great. We're really across the board on this. That's awesome. Very interesting fact. I think we're starting to see more adoption of AppV, which is great to see some of you already using it. But definitely, as I go into the next slide, we'll see where that really becomes a real possible game changer or a winner for you as you go forward with your architecture. Okay, so this chart is really what we were talking about before. It's these layers of abstraction of all the environments, and I'm going to take a few minutes to go over it from the bottom up. And again, I know that Shannon mentioned earlier, this one may have the most questions, so as you have questions, by all means, please hit the button or type it in and hit the button so we know what you're thinking, and we'll try to address as many as possible. So the layered approach really does a few things for you. The goal is to make all of these components as distinct and independent from one another, because that will give you the greatest flexibility and control of the environment in general, whether it's physical or virtual, or the combination of the two. It'll create a level of consistency, but it'll also create some level of ease of management, because you're doing things in one place, and it transcends all the environments. So at the infrastructure level, that's pretty straightforward, right? Just making sure that you have the right amount of storage, compute, and memory carved out for this, making sure that you're at the right levels of VMware or whichever your hypervisor is to quickly provide these desktops. What's important here at the infrastructure level is truly trying to either isolate it or protect it from other changes, right? So you don't want to necessarily compete for resources in a VDI environment, right? Because you don't want to have unpredictable performance based on things outside of your control. And we understand that's not always the case, and that you have to make some compromises from a cost perspective. But it's so important that that base layer is solid, because at the end of the day, you're being judged at the level of service you're delivering, not at the availability alone, right? So it has to perform. The next tier, that operating system, that's really the image, right? The PC image, we strongly urge, is as light as possible, has as few apps as possible in it, no user data, no user personalization. What happens here is it allows us to really strive for a much more non-persistent environment, or a shared environment, if you go down the XenApp path, that lets you manage this thing very cleanly, but also consolidate the resources you need to deliver the whole solution. So image goal is always as few things as possible, only core apps, possibly only the apps everybody's going to get, the apps that aren't going to change that often. Those things that we can test easily, that's what we want to put in the image. A layer above that, or I'm sorry, access, is truly much more independent in general, typically, because it's something like your access and authentication controls, how you want to get in, whether it's via NetScaler or something else, to really drive that consistent entry point. It looks the same every time. it's easy to navigate, etc. The tier above it is probably the tier that gets to be the most tricky, but also is the most beneficial. How you deliver applications. So we talked about the image being light a second ago. Really, what we're really seeing more and more, and we're really urging, is really separating app delivery from image delivery. So using things like Microsoft AppV or XenApp to deliver the applications to the right people at the right time. What's great about those technologies is both can be used on a physical or virtual desktop. So if a user needs an application to do their job, maybe it's Microsoft Visio, let's say, for an architect, they can get that application delivered to them via basically group policy on their physical or their virtual machine. And it only has to be set up once. What's nice about that too is application owners can then control version updates. They don't conflict with the applications that are already installed on the image, and they can be preloaded in some cases for performance. Profiles, creating the profile that is very similar to the old roaming profile that can be applied to all environments. So when that user logs in, they see the same desktop background, they have their signature in Outlook, they have the same ribbons in their Office tools, etc., etc., etc. Making that independent of the VDI environment, again, allows for much greater adoption of non-persistent desktops or a shared desktop that the user thinks they're getting a very custom and personalized experience, but from your perspective and from the management of the solution, you don't need to treat each PC or each virtual PC as a one-off. Policies, the thing to say here is really that login process or any of the group policies being applied really be as lean as possible. Again, it's all about responsiveness and performance, right? It's all about when a change is made, it doesn't blow up the virtual desktop. So making sure that those policies are really clean and somewhat independent of each other, so the startup policies and practices are different than some of the user-based policies and practices. The tier above that is really making sure that the user data isn't in the image but is always available and is very close to the VDI environment, right? So again, best possible experience when it's nearby. Endpoints, know your endpoints. Leverage the endpoint for what it is, make it independent of the image, but also leverage the endpoint when, for example, you want someone to do something very video-rich from the internet. We've been able to show clients how to use the endpoints processing to present that web or internet experience that does not take cycles from the VDI environment and does provide a more local and more, I guess, typical viewing experience. And lastly, desktop management, and that's really kind of encompasses everything, which was really around how do you manage the physical and virtual desktops in a way that's consistent, as when you make these changes and you develop these policies or you develop the profiles, that it really does flow across how you deliver the OS, the patches, the updates, the applications, and access to data. And then on the right, there are some variables you can consider when we're making those design decisions. Again, this is probably the one that might have the most questions, so please feel free to send them in. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit to education. We're going to educate the users. That is very important. And I think what's important to educate the users on, and it's not how do you use Citrix Receiver to get into your system or how to do dual-factor authentication. All that stuff obviously needs to be done, but really when to use what. Excuse me. That's probably the most important thing, and often you'll get frustration from the user or questions from the user, and you say, why did you do it that way? You could just go to your email client on your phone. You don't need to start the VDI session to get to Outlook, for example. I mean, that's obviously a rare occurrence, but it's indicative of sometimes people can get to information in an easier way, and VDI is not always the tool to use. Or in reverse, many times VDI or virtualized applications are the right tool to use. It's when to get to them, how to get to them, what device to use. Don't use a small screen format for Excel. Wait till you get to your home PC, things like that. Second, a better understanding of how they connect. I know this is probably the most difficult one. They almost shouldn't care or don't want to care, but the more they can see that there's an endpoint, there's an internet connection, there's a network connection, there's a server, there's all these different pieces that when they call up and say I can't get in from my shore house, that it's easier for the help desk and for them to understand, oh, it might be this, it might be that. It isn't necessarily Citrix, right? And then the last thing I think is important is, again, that salesmanship of what's in it for them. what is the real benefit so that when they do have a frustrating moment, they realize there is a trade-off and there is value. And we'll talk about that in the PR section in a second. And then education and information technology, right? There are three distinct areas, maybe more, but the three I think that are most important is the infrastructure team itself, and that's not just the people running Citrix. Those folks usually get some training, they shadow the guys who help design it and implement it, but the storage guys, the network guys, the server guys, they all need to understand the implications of VDI. You're delivering, again, this service of a desktop now. You know, the old desktop that was physical and sitting on someone's desk was insulated from the storage issue, was insulated from the network issue. The virtual desktop isn't. So it's really important that they understand what they're doing, what the impact decisions they make are on VDI, what the impact of the technology choices they make are, and how all the pieces work together. The application team, same thing. You know, as we show them more and more around AppV, they now have this opportunity to leverage it, maybe bundle things together in packages that can be streamed and delivered to any desktop, but they need to understand the pros and cons of that. And they need to understand what's different about a virtual environment from a physical environment so that when they make decisions, especially design and architecture decisions around an application, that they're done correctly. And lastly, the help desk needs to know a lot more than just what is Citrix, because we want them to be our champions about what the problem really is, or what the best way to solve a problem is, and not just say, oh, VDI is down today, or Citrix is a problem, et cetera, et cetera. And then the last area I think that we want to touch on is the PR team. Oh, no, I skipped one, I'm sorry. So implementing strong systems management. And I know we're running up against the clock, so I'll try to get through this quickly and get some questions. So implementing systems management, two parts. One is operations. This service is very visible to users at all times, so making sure that you're doing standard and practical maintenance of the environment, making sure that you have strong testing procedures and practices. VDI is easy to test and roll, or easy to implement and roll back, or update and roll back, but you don't want that to be the norm, right? You want to make sure that when updates are made, they're seamless and the user is excited about what they're getting quickly. And then also in operations, and I touched on it a second ago, is making sure all the teams are collaborating around change control. You need to know when the network team's making a change, or when this team's making a change, or the security team applies a new update, because we need to quickly be able to understand the implication, we need to test, and we need to know how to resolve the issues, which folds into monitoring and support. Monitoring Citrix is not just making sure the servers are up, or the database is functioning, or the IOPS are good on the storage side. It really is end-to-end. When users call, it's rarely a Citrix issue, but if we don't have the insight into what the problem is, we're not going to quickly resolve issues. We're not going to quickly identify the problem and explain to the user what the situation is. And then lastly on that one is making sure that you're looking at how the Citrix tools meet your needs there and integrate them with your processes, but also look to third parties for both services or tools to really run the Citrix environment the best. This service that you're providing is kind of your first impression of IT to the user community. It's worth the investment to get the operational part right so that it is consistent and is bulletproof when the users want to click on the icon to get in there. Lastly is the PR team. And I think anybody on the call who's got a Citrix environment knows that any problem that occurs is a Citrix problem, or it is a VDI problem. So building the right PR team really helps us get away from that. And the first thing is create a brand. Your brand is not VDI or Citrix. So when someone says Citrix is no good, or Citrix doesn't work, or Citrix is slow, or why do we use Citrix, that's when we're not doing the right, we're not selling the value, we're selling the product, right? So the idea here is make sure that you're giving them all the benefits all the time. Make sure that the message out is we're going down this path in order to give you A, B, and C. Get work done from anywhere. Nomads get the same experience whatever city they're in. New applications may be available in 48 hours, which used to take days or weeks in the past. Security changes are implemented firm-wide overnight. You have BYOD, or bring another device to work. All those kind of things are why you're doing this, not just to use Citrix, right? So making sure that you really create that brand. Next, you got to find yourself an executive sponsor who really gets the value of this thing, who can talk about it in meetings and can get folks on board. And then you want to review the benefits regularly. If you had a snowstorm and people could work that day, make sure you're touting that. Make sure that they're touting that the firm was able to work even though no one can get to the office. Next, you want to enlist key users, right, that are vocal, that are going to talk about things. You want to get them on board with the value, but then give them stuff, right? Give them the newest iPhone first. Give them the newest access to new apps. Let them try the new remote access authentication solution, whatever, so they feel like they're in the know and that they're going to be your biggest supporters. And then lastly, and I think probably the most challenging sometimes, is make sure the help desk is really trying to figure out what the problem is, or really trying and consciously communicating to the user that it's not a Citrix problem, that Citrix is affected by the problem, and that's why we're having a situation. I know I'm going very rapidly, and I try to be very respectful of your time, and very happy to dig deeper into any of these outside of this webinar. But in summary, just want to say that the high level takeaway here is make sure you meet a business need, build it and run it the right way, and celebrate the value of it whenever you can. As a result of that, you'll have a strong foundation for new mobility, rapid technology deployment, and any of the compliance requirements you have in the future. With that, I'll ask Shannon, do we have any questions?
We do, and please continue to log your questions. We'll keep this open for a few minutes after the session closes out. I know we're running short on time, but we're happy to reach out and answer any of the additional questions directly, but we'll go ahead and just take one and close it out. So this question is, what are some of the more common mistakes you see people make when they take on VDI?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, whoever submitted it. So what we see most frequently is this, what I call the P to V, where someone takes desktops and says, we're just going to give everyone a persistent desktop because that's easiest, and they try to convert the existing PC image into VDI and deploy it out to users. Well, the users have already seen it on a physical level, and now on the virtual level, it's not going to work quite the same. Plus, you've got all this overhead of all the junk that's been in that image for years and years and years. And I think we don't see enough people take the time to really re-architect that image in the best way possible and really make a big push towards non-persistent. I think that's one of the things that we've been able to add that value with our clients, but also I think that with firms that do that consciously see a much better return and a much better acceptance from the user community. Okay, so again, as Shannon said, please continue to get your questions in. I want to thank you all very, very much for joining us, and please reach out to me directly. My number is on the screen there, and so is my email, for further discussions. I look forward to doing webinars with all of you again in the new year, and I'd like